Good morning and welcome everyone in person and online. My name is Tino Cuéllar and I am the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Also relevant for today, I named my daughter after a Brazilian city. So it is a special pleasure to welcome Ambassador Amorim. At Carnegie, our vision of peace is about more than the absence of war. It's about a world capable of international cooperation on shared challenges. A world where good governance delivers prosperity to billions of people around the world. And it's clear that moving the world in that direction hinges on the actions of several increasingly influential powers. One of those powers is Brazil. It has the world's 8th largest economy in terms of GDP, the largest in Latin America, has the 7th largest population globally. It's a member of the G20 and serves actually as the president of the G20 at this point. Because of its scale and reach, it's gaining influence among other emerging powers like India and South Africa. And it's well positioned to play a leading role on all the global issues that are going to define the future. Which is why the solutions to problems that we work on here at Carnegie, around tech policy, around climate, around global order, run through Brazil. Fighting climate change, dealing with biodiversity collapse requires a healthy and lush Amazon, 60% of which falls in Brazil. Strengthening global food security means enhancing the sustainability of food systems, including in Brazil, which feeds about 800 million people around the world. Protecting democracy globally depends on nurturing its resilience in Brazil. Tempering discord to reduce risks of conflict runs through Brazil. And learning from how to solve governance problems at scale in a continent-sized country runs through Brazil. All of which means Brazil has a crucial role at the global stage and is a critical country for American policymakers too. The U.S. is Brazil's 2nd largest trading partner. The U.S. and Brazil share interest in cooperating on democracy, climate change, artificial intelligence. But Brazil and the U.S. also diverge in prominent issues. With respect to how to deal with some of the dramatic developments in Europe and Russia and Eurasia or in Ukraine, China's role in the world. These sorts of differences mean it's even more important to understand Brazil's vision for the future, for its future, for the future of the region, for the future of the world ultimately, because it's a world where emerging powers will assert ever greater influence. To that end, it is a privilege to be joined today by Ambassador Celso Amorim. Ambassador Amorim is the chief advisor to the President of Brazil, President Lula, and has had a distinguished diplomatic career. He served as Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1993 to 1994. He then served as Brazil's permanent representative to the United Nations and later as ambassador to the United Kingdom. From 2003 to 2010, 7 eventful years, he returned to the role of foreign minister, and then from 2011 to 2014, he served as Minister of Defense. To date, Ambassador Amorim holds the record still for longest service as Brazil's foreign minister. In conversation with Ambassador Amorim is our own Dan Baer, former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and Carnegie's senior vice president for policy research. In this capacity, Dan leads our policy and research across the organization and directly oversees our work on climate, Europe, and American statecraft, which will make him a great partner in conversation for Ambassador Amorim. Thank you for being with us today, and Dan, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Tino. Thank you, Tino, and thank you, Ambassador Amorim, for choosing to be with us here today in your visit to the United States. We're glad to have you and look forward to a good conversation. Just to preview for all of you in the audience, including online, I'm going to ask a few questions to start us off.
I was waiting for the fireplace.
You know, we should have a kind of artificial fireside chat accessory here. I'm going to ask a few questions to start off the conversation, but we will turn toward the end of our time together to the audience and welcome questions from the audience. When you enter, for those of you in the room, when you enter questions through the QR code that is on your seat, it will magically appear on my iPad, and therefore I will be able to transmit them to the ambassador. I'm going to start local, that is to say Washington, D.C., and we'll go global in a second. But obviously, this is an official visit to the United States. I know that you met with our National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, And I wonder, as you look at the U.S. Brazil bilateral relationship, what do you see as areas of opportunity in the coming years, and what do you see as the things that we should be working on together to kind of put on a better track?
Well, I think there is a paradox in a way. First of all, thank you very much to receive me here. I think there is a paradox in a way because I think there had never, as far as I remember, such a good relation between presidents as there is between President Lula and President Biden. I think the two of them are very much devoted to social justice. They're very much devoted, their vision of economy is very similar, of course, with the difference of the countries, of course. And there is a really good, very good chemistry between them. And I would say that I more or less tend to replicate that on a lower level with Jake Sullivan. We have very good relations, we have conversations on various subjects, and I'm sure also this is true of the foreign minister. So these are especially positive. On the other hand, there are differences in foreign policy, I would say, not so much in relation to Latin America. I think we appreciate the Biden attitudes in relation to Latin America in general. I'm speaking in general, to respect the choices of each country, and this is a very important thing. On the other hand, I think in many global issues, not all of them, for instance, sustainable development, we are very much see eye to eye. I would say even in the question of a more egalitarian world, I think also we see eye to eye. But when it comes to geopolitics, I think there are differences.
Okay, we're going to get to those in a moment. But before we get to the harder issues, Brazil is chairing the G20 this year. At the outset of the year, Brazil laid out several broad areas of focus. They pick up on some of the parts where you said that President Lula and President Biden share a commitment on, for instance, the commitment to workers and supporting workers. So their focus on economic, social, and environmental justice, on hunger, poverty, and inequality, on improving global governance. Within those broad themes, have you started to focus on kind of tangible outcomes that you hope to see at the summit in November?
Well, the summit in November, it will be, from the point of view of the relations of Brazil-United States, we don't know yet who will be the president in the United States, so it will have to be...
Well, Biden will still be the president in November.
Sorry?
Joe Biden will still be the president in November because we won't have an inauguration until January. So it's clear who the American administration will be in November.
Yes. Well, our emphasis in the G20 meeting will be sustainable development, where we hope that the richer countries will put their money where their mouth is, so to say. We will be putting a lot of emphasis on the question of a more fair distribution of income, and including some sort of tax on the extra rich, which are basic in the United States and in China. You have this similarity at least. I think that Lula will create a special, he wants to create a special task force on equality. I think this will be and of course the global governance. We do think that there is a thinker in the United States that I think I met her once very quickly, but I admire her way of thinking, Anne-Marie Slaughter. And I was part of a video conference with her, and she said something, not exact words. Can you imagine Europe in the beginning of the 20th century being governed by the rules of the Congress of Vienna? So that's more or less what we have today. 80 years afterwards, the Second World War, we still have the same rules. It can't do the same work. And we only have China because actually the United States made a mistake. So it was that was the reason, because the United States insisted in having China in the either you had an extraordinary foresight or you made a mistake. I don't know.
I think you'd probably find some Americans who think the former and some who think the latter even today. Okay, let's go. Let's dig
Just
deeper.
speak more slowly because I have.
Let's dig deeper on what you said on global governance, and because one way to hear what you just said is that you think that the rules of the game internationally need to be completely rewritten, that the rules-based order, so to speak, that was.
I don't like rules-based order.
Nobody does, but nobody has come up with a better way of describing.
There is a better world, international law.
So fine, let's go there. You have questions about the existing framework.
Let's leave it.
What is the affirmative proposal for a different framework?
One.
What is the vision for something different?
Well, this is not easy. You know, I was ambassador to the United Nations, and later on as foreign minister, I devoted a lot of my thinking and my effort to the change in the Security Council. Certainly, it's a big example of how it should not be run. I mean, what you have in the Security Council nowadays is that the countries that have the veto are the countries that disrespect the international law. Both, you can judge the situation according to your will, but from the formal point of view, the invasion of Iraq was the same thing as the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, from the formal point of view. In both cases, you have one big power using its own power to do what it thinks is right. I'm not going into the details of what's right and what is wrong.
It's a legal equivalence,
But
not a
it's a
moral.
legal question. I mean, it's all right to say that Russia now broke international law because it disrespected the basic principle of territorial integrity of states, but so did the U.S. When it invaded Iraq without approval by the Security Council. So that's just two examples of how this works. And apart from that, I mean, there is another aspect which makes me feel concerned with that. More and more, all the subjects, environment, poverty, immigration, they're all seen as related to security. And indeed, it's true. I think it is so. So what happens? It's that almost all the subjects are now dependent. I was a member of a panel on Ebola, and there was a resolution of Security Council on that. That's totally absurd in relation to what it was sought. You know, everything becomes a security issue, so everything becomes subject to the veto. I think that's totally wrong. I can understand the veto when it was created. Not saying that I agree, but I can understand. We were too near the World War, and in a very dangerous case, either Stalin or no longer Roosevelt, Truman, might decided to use the veto to avoid a broader war. But there is no reason for that now.
Okay.
So just finalizing, if you wish, my reading. I think now the closest thing that exists, which can be used as a model for global governance, is the G20. The G20 has no real power in terms of sanctions, but it has influence, and it has influence. And this was proven already with a very small, very slight change in in the quota system of the IMF. There was first a recommendation by the G20, and later on, it had to pass the U.S. Congress, which took some time. But anyway, there was this change. So it's the closest thing, I think, to a because in all governance, I'm sorry, I'm being too long, but anyway, I will finalize. There is always a balance between representativeness and efficiency. Well, the most efficient will be the body with one member, of course, but it's not representative. The most representative is something equivalent to the General Assembly, but it's not effective. So you have to find a balance. And the G20, maybe with 2 more Africans and maybe 1 European less, would be the one more.
I would add to your representativeness and efficiency a third dimension, which is legitimacy. And I think that also plays a role in the ability of an organization or a collective to be able to influence outcomes. But I want to go back because you referenced Anne-Marie Slaughter, and you corrected me when I said rules-based order, and you said the alternative is international law, which evidences a commitment on your part to having some sort of rules, law, some sort of strictures on power globally.
Yes.
And yet, after pointing out several problems with the existing system or cases of on the one hand, on the other, the suggestion you have is that the G20, which is really not a legal force, but a political conglomeration, is really an expression of what you might call multipolarity, or it's a balance of power tool, not a legal tool. So are you content to live in a world where all we do is balance power and we don't have any real rules?
Well, you know, a rule of law or a legal, how to say, the rules-based order, it's more or less like Alice in the Wonderland, you know. The rules-based order change as you wish. I think there is I understand your point, there might be a contradiction, but I don't think so, because I think in the end, the G20 is an inspirational organ. I mean, if they agree, it's because it possibly can become law, but it has to become law. It has to be something everyone has to abide by, because a rules-based order, you really don't know which rules you are referring to and how do they change. Now, is the rules-based order what the U.S. wants or what Russia wants? I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think that international law, it's like in our own life. You can say that you have a rules-based order with your neighbor, but there is a law that allows you to do some things that doesn't allow to do other things. The rules-based order maybe can be an addition, but it's not a substitute for international law.
I would submit to you that I think it remains much easier to criticize it, especially for countries that won't be held responsible for solving the problems of the world when the real crises happen. It's easier to do that than it is to imagine what the alternative is. And you know, eliminating the veto in the Security Council or expanding the Security Council, those are adjustments. Those aren't revolutions. Those are very difficult adjustments, but those are adjustments to the order we have or the system we have. But imagining a new system, I think, is much harder, especially if you take responsibility for the transition to that new system.
It's difficult, but it's necessary.
So one of the places where Brazil has invested diplomatic and political capital in recent years is the BRICS, which you played a role in kind of the emergence of, you personally. And the BRICS, now we'll get back to representativeness and efficiency and legitimacy, the BRICS have recently decided to invite some new members, the majority of which are authoritarian regimes, so that you as a democracy are now
They're
outnumbered.
not authoritarian.
No, I said you are a democracy. Brazil is a democracy. India is a democracy. South Africa is democracy. But you are, democracies in BRICS are outnumbered by authoritarian regimes now. Do you think that will make that a less useful forum for you?
We don't want to make the BRICS replacement for the broader international order. On the contrary, actually, the other day, I think I can mention him because the words are mine, not his, and I'm not saying that he agreed. But I have a very good friend who is David Miliband, who is the chairman of Rescue, and he was foreign minister of Britain. And he asked me, why do you put so much emphasis on the BRICS? And I said, to reinforce the G20. Because why? I mean, it sounds contradictory, but it's not. Because if we don't do that, what happens is that you come back to what we had before, which was G7 having the role of the G20. The G7 are just 7 very rich countries which don't represent the world. I think the world is much more, nothing is exact. Nothing is exact. Fortunately, I mean, we live in a world which is not precise geometrical. But anyway, the G20 is much more representative of the current world than the G7. And we'll have, so when we reinforce the BRICS, we are automatically telling the G7, you are not enough. You cannot rule us. Because what I have seen in the last few years, and actually Lula has gone to the 2 meetings of the G7, because you have to go after all. But it's not the G7 that should rule the world. If something is nearer to, not rule, but at least give the inspiration to the world, is G20. And by reinforcing the BRICS, we are underlining that point. So you're not enough. You have to consider India, you have to consider China, you have to consider South Africa, you have to consider Brazil.
And you think the addition of the Egyptian regime, the Iranian regime, the UAE, Ethiopia, gives more legitimacy to the G20?
I don't know, but I think there is in a way, I'm sorry to say that, I mean, maybe I shouldn't. There is a side of religious undertone in the U.S. way of seeing it. I don't have anything against, well, I don't agree with the way that women are treated in Iran, for instance, but I don't agree with death penalty, which still exists in the United States. I think it's an important country. It's 80 million people in a very, very crucial region of the world. So why not? I mean, maybe you now saw there was an election in Iran. Apparently, it's a more moderate president. Well, maybe it's an influence that the BRICS are also exerting. You never know.
When I served as a U.S. ambassador, I made a personal plea to President Obama on the death penalty because
Where were you?
I was ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I was often instructed to defend the U.S. application of the death penalty as a representative of my country. As you know, we often get instructed to do things that we might not personally agree with. The one conversation I had with President Obama while I was ambassador,
You were ambassador where? I'm sorry.
To the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe.
OEC?
OSCE, yeah. And I raised that issue with him and said that it was my least favorite part of my job was having to defend that, and I think the United States should end the practice of capital punishment because it makes us an outlier among advanced democracies. So I will
agree with you.
I will concede the point. I will also say that to draw an equivalence between the United States application of the death penalty and the Iranian regime is morally not respectable. I think it's a bad equivalence, and I think it undermines the moral credibility of those who would draw that kind of equivalence. I want to dig further into multipolarity and how you see the world, the bricks you've cast as a way of supporting the effectiveness of the G20. If you look at Brazil's agenda for the G20, there are things that are not on there that are obviously important for the world. Resolution of wars, the prevention of the next financial crisis, which we know there will be another economic crisis that will affect all of us because we are all connected. We could go on, the next pandemic. Do you believe that the G20 can solve those problems? What if we imagine a multipolar world, who's responsible for the crises that affect us all?
Oh, no one can solve these problems by oneself. It's a complex question, of course, but I think the G20 can be a good source of inspiration. I was very much involved with health questions during a certain period of my life, health, international health. And I, for instance, went to I was invited by the Secretary General to be part of a panel on Ebola. And I saw the recommendations, and if you look at, this was 2011, 12, maybe something like that.
When
Yes, and if you see the recommendations there are there, if you just read the summary of the report, you see that there is a series of recommendations which were not carried out. And of course, if you look at them, it's exactly what caused the pandemics, the more recent pandemics, the COVID-19. So, you know, I think we are still very much not determined enough in our decisions. That's probably one of the main problems. But this is not the fault, I believe, in that case of the organization, although there is also a fault of the organization. For instance, there is the organization, World Health Organization. And I don't remember the exact numbers, so you will forgive me if I make a mistake. But let us say it is about $10 billion, the whole. $5 billion are given by private donors, and they are targeted to some specific diseases. So I don't think this is the correct. What you have to do is to reinforce the health systems everywhere and so on. I mean, I'm just giving you an example of how far we are. And I think the G20 can really be an inspiration. It's not the G20 that will do the things. What will do the things is the World Health Organization, but change it in a way that the G20 can inspire. So that's what I think. Very briefly, because it's very complex questions, of course, that you are. And the same thing happened in other organizations as well.
The United States and Brazil have obviously had private discussions and some public back and forth over Brazil's position with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I know that you have a long personal friendship with the Russian foreign minister.
With whom?
Sergei Lavrov. I wonder how you think about...
I have a long friendship with Bill Burns also.
I mean...
I think so. I mean, I can't deny that. I don't.
Let me confess that I am deeply suspicious of people who answer on the one hand, on the other to everything. But I also like Bill Burns a lot. And I have worked with Sergei Lavrov.
As it should be.
As it should be. When you think about Brazil's own interests in international law, understanding your criticisms of the United States, of Russia, what do you think Brazil has to do in order to secure its interests in the upholding of international law? And does that require more political leadership from Brazil on the global stage in being a spokesperson for it?
Well, yes, of course, there was a break on international law on the part of the Russians by invading Ukraine. I have no doubt about that, and I have said that several times. But one thing is to condemn a country, maybe even if it's, but the right way. I mean, you cannot impose sanctions in the way that is done by Europe or the United States. It would have to be the Security Council. It's the only body the only body that is. So if you tell me that the Security Council doesn't do it, reform it, but don't use any subterfuge. But anyway, but on the other hand, if you want to find a solution, sometimes you have to be a bit pragmatic. You know, the other day I was saying, you know, he was very criticized in Latin America, the person I'll mention, very criticized in Latin America because what happened in Chile and in other countries, Kissinger. But I think the world needs a Kissinger nowadays, needs someone who is able to look at things in a more pragmatic way. You know, you cannot, I mean, first of all, let us say, you won't destroy Russia. And say, our objective is not to destroy, but what you're doing is in that direction, trying to do it never happened. So it only reinforces their position against poor Ukraine, which is being smashed among the, let us say, the self-righteousness of the West and if you call brutality or whatever, of the Russians. So I think you need people that can talk to both countries. I've talked about Ukraine many times with Jake Sullivan and others. We don't agree, but we have talked many times. And I went to Russia also to talk to them. I went to France, I went to Germany, and we have to find a way that is pragmatic. I don't know exactly what the solution, I won't preach the solution, but there must be a point in which both sides are tired and they have to come to a conclusion. And that's what we have to do. And we have to have people that can somehow be in the midway and try to help them. I don't know exactly what the solution is. I don't want to preach any solution. But there are, because if you go into history, it's very complicated. Very complicated, because history before it was one thing, before that there was another thing, before that was another thing. If the borders of 91...
People who don't obey the law like
Sorry?
Those who don't obey the law like to talk about history instead.
Yes, but you know, there is a dictum by Pascal, Blaise Pascal, the French guy, who said that being unable to make the lawful or the right being strong, one has made the strong being lawful. So that's more or less what happens. I mean, you have to find a solution there that can be accepted by both sides. I don't want to go into the merits because it's too long. Of course, what the Russians say that if Ukraine gets into NATO, there will be 300 kilometers from Moscow, and that's something they cannot support and they cannot accept, and so on and so forth. So I don't know, but I think you have to deal with both of them. You cannot ignore them, and you cannot think that you'll defeat them, because they would. I remember very clearly in the beginning of the war, some very important people, I'm not exaggerating, saying we have to destroy Russia. I remember that, I read that. It's not something that I'm inventing. And you know, what comes next? What comes next? I don't want to mention Chechnya, Dagestan. I mean, we're all becoming independent countries. And if they become the hotbeds for a new kind of Al-Qaeda, what are we going to do? So I think you have to really see things in a more realistic way.
the mix of when you want us to be religious and wait for the Security Council, despite it not being pragmatic, and when you want us to be pragmatic is one that I think deserves more disentangling, but I want to make sure that we have time for the audience. So I'm going to ask you a last question before turning to the audience, which is a personal one, which is, Tino talked about the fact that you are the longest serving Brazilian foreign minister when you add up your time as foreign minister. Sergei Lavrov has been the foreign minister for Russia for 20 years. And by my observation, not yours, he has gotten nicer and nicer watches on his wrist over 20 years, but farther and farther away from actually making foreign policy. And I wonder whether you think he ever privately gets tired of becoming more and more a salesman for policy. He's a talented diplomat, as he should be after 20 years. But do you think, as his friend, does he get tired of being a salesman for policy rather than a maker of policy?
Well, you are making much about our friendship. Anyway, we spent years without seeing each other. I have known Lavrov for a long time, as I have known other people for a long time. I think he has a big capacity of adaptation also, which is certainly true. Others also have. I mean, when we speak of the great diplomats of the world, we remember Talleyrand. Talleyrand served the French, the kingdom, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic. So, I know, one thing is to be a great diplomat, the other thing is to agree with their ideas. It's different. At the time that I dealt with Lavrov quite intimately, I would say, was the time in which you were preparing invasion of Iraq. And we both had the same position, as had the French Déjamais, also in the Security Council, Alain Déjamais, which was probably my best teacher in terms of multilateral diplomacy. So, I mean, we don't need to agree with a person every time. I mean, we disagree. You know, once Lavrov came to me years ago, and he said, oh, Brazil is the only country that has not yet accepted the Russian conditions to become a member of the WTO. And I said, what would you think if I said that Russia is the only country in Eastern Europe that has not yet accepted Brazil? You know, it's a completely wrong standard. So I don't agree with him always, but he's a great diplomat and a good person.
I'll grant you the former, not the latter. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. So these have come in from either people in the room or online. The first is, how should we understand Brazil's desire to deepen its relationship with China in light of your desire to have an international system that is governed by international law? How do you view the claims that China violates the international law in the South China Sea?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I understood the whole question, but from all the main gist, yes. I think we're not making moral judgments all the time. Sometimes, yes, we have to do because the moral thing becomes so big, like it happened in the Holocaust or how it's happening in Israel now. I mean, this requires moral judgment beyond just the practical thing. But many times we don't want to see the destruction of the world. We don't see the problems that will come between a frontal confrontation. Frontal confrontation is a pleonasm anyway, but I mean a big confrontation between the West and Russia.
With China, does Brazil take a view on China's violation of international law in the South China Sea? Do you see that as a risk to the international order?
I'm not a specialist on the South China Sea question, to be honest, so I have to be humble here and avoid the answer.
If you had to define one priority for the U.S. Brazil relationship moving forward, what would it be?
I'm sorry.
If there were one priority for the United States and Brazil moving forward in our relationship, what would you make that priority?
I might say something that is in vogue now, like sustainable development, I don't know. But maybe I would be happier if I could see the United States participating really in this combating of hunger. You know, do what you do inside, also in the world.
Okay. This question is about the G20, which you spoke about as a kind of inspiration. And this person would like to know, do you think that giving countries like Brazil the power to veto is a way to change the inspirational order of a G20 into something that is more rules-based?
Oh, there is the veto as exists in the UN, and the veto that might exist in a group like the G20, which is a kind of informal veto. Of course, nothing that the United States or China, for that matter, are totally contrary will be approved. That's certain. And that's part of life. We may like it or not. The wrong thing is to stratify that and make it, I mean, the Russians did that for a long time during the Cold War, as you know, the Soviets, and the United States is doing now the same thing. I mean, there were situations relating to, Brazil wasn't, during a certain time, was in the presidency of the Security Council. And very often you had resolutions that everyone accepted or abstained, and the United States voted against. That's very bad, I think, for the system. But it happens. It's part of the law. So we have to respect the law.
Since President Lula's election, there's been a resumption of a consistency in Brazil's relationship to Israel-Palestine. And given the current war, I wonder what you think the Brazilian relationship with the Palestinians and the Israelis looks like right now, and what's the status of that relationship, and how do you think that the United States or others should be helping to move toward a resolution?
Well, I understand that many people in the United States are putting pressure in Israel to stop the killing. I'm not justifying what happened in the Hamas attack. That's a different thing. But I don't know, I don't think that destroying completely people and what they believe to be their nation will help in any way. I think this is really, I mean, who am I to judge? I've been with several, to judge the present statesman, but I've been in Israel 5 or 6 times, and I have been in Palestine equal times. And I mean, the people that you saw there were people that could talk, Even, I mean, with Sharon, who was very hardliner, we ended our conversation by exchanging photos of our grandchildren. So you could talk to those people. Later on, Olmert, I think he was a very hard, in a way, in discussion, but he was really interested in peace. And since the word, how do you call that? This juridical warfare became very common in Brazil. I think the same might have, I don't know the details, but I think he fell because probably he wanted peace. That's my impression. And impression. I don't have any proof of that. So I think there were people who wanted to talk, and might be hard, might be difficult, may not be, let us say, peaceniks or whatever, but they wanted, and I don't see that now. I mean, I see since we are in a let us say, intellectual setting, I think what the present rulers in Israel are doing is very bad for Israel itself. Very bad for Israel itself. I mean, I won't say the famous phrase, some of my best friends are Jews, because it's the first phrase that an anti-Semitic says. But anyway, Brazil is a country that prides itself of the mixture. So, I mean, there's nothing racial or nothing religious about that. But I think the present rulers of Israel are really doing a lot of damage to Israel. For instance, our group, Mercosur, you have heard of Mercosur. The first agreement that we had, the first trade agreement we had with a country outside the region, outside South America, was with Israel. With Israel. I think that would never happen now. That not happen now. So
let's come back. We have 10 minutes left.
it was Lula's government, not to say that there was a change in our government. It was Lula's government.
We have more questions than we will have time for because we have 10 minutes left. But there are two questions that pertain to our hemisphere. One is a question from the audience. Why has Brazil not taken a stronger role to respond to the security and humanitarian crisis in Haiti? Brazil is a major leader.
In Haiti?
Brazil is a major leader in the hemisphere, and if Brazil did more, wouldn't others follow? The second question is about Venezuela, and there had been a decision, it said Brazil has just announced that it will send election monitors to Venezuela. And before it had said it wouldn't, and the person wants to know what changed.
I didn't understand totally your question and the relations between Haiti and Venezuela. But anyway, nobody can give us lessons about Haiti. Brazil was there for 15 years or so with our soldiers, with our officials, officers, and President Lula visited Haiti about 3 or 4 times. I went there 15 times, and we tried to do our best. Very difficult to say what is the best, but we tried to do the best we could actually. For instance, one of the generals that was the force commander in Haiti, who was appointed later on by the United Nations without any interference on our part as the force commander in Congo, in the DRC, which was he's the biggest and most robust
UN mission.
Force of the United Nations. So I think we did our best. I think very often, the best period, I think, in Haiti during the 15 years we were there more clearly was just after the election of Preval. Preval was, well, no one is perfect, but he was reasonable, and he was elected by the people, and they tried to change the reason of the election, and someone, I don't mention who, two very important people say, oh, there is no problem. We make a second round or a plebiscite in 2 months. I said, well, do you know, we are not in Switzerland. We are in Haiti. You know, the country will be destroyed before you have time to do this, because it's certainly, he was being robbed of his votes, very simply, so very clear to every one of us. So anyway, this is one case. The other thing, we did our best to have an honest election after the earthquake, and it was really not honest. I don't want to go into details here, but there was a situation which was completely because people didn't want that someone related to Preval got elected. That was the reason. I went later as chief observer of the OAS, was not able to stay much longer because I disagreed a lot with what was happening, or they disagreed with me, I don't know. But anyway, and I saw how things were deteriorating very quickly, and the so-called international community very hasty to go away. And I said, well, but you can't go away now. Now, not with this situation. Oh, no, there are the Canadians training the police and so on and so forth. The Canadians are very good, but the capacity of... So there are many, 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 many flaws in the situation. We gave... I'll finish. That's just one. The biggest donation Brazil ever made... Brazil is a poor country, you know. The biggest donation Brazil made to another country, except once to Paraguay, which was in a multilateral setting. But anyway, the biggest was to Haiti. It was not much, $40 million. But we thought, because one of the big problems of Haiti is energy. And our $40 million were to help build a dam, which would probably alleviate a lot of the problems that Haiti had with energy. But we gave the 40 million, expecting that France would give 30 million, that the United States would give 80 million and whatever and so on. But nobody gave, because everyone made a condition of they would only give the money if their own companies would do the work, you know? So that's the generosity that you see very often in some of the aiding countries. So that's Haiti. I didn't know about Venezuela, what you said.
Just to clarify, I think the question about Haiti was in line with your answer that Brazil has great experience and influence and would be seen as a leader in the region throughout the hemisphere if it took a more active role today, understanding that you've taken a very active role.
But that all disappeared in smoke.
So it was a friendly question encouraging leadership, not trying to teach a lesson. On Venezuela, the question was, there seems to have been a change in Brazil's position on whether or not to send election monitors, and what was the origin of the change in that position?
Well, the opposition in Venezuela is very happy with Brazil. They had said that thanks to Brazil, they were able to choose a candidate. Now let us see how the election goes. But you know, in everything you need some dose of pragmatism. And in everything you need some, and that is true for several of the people involved.
One of the humanitarian efforts that Brazil has made in recent years is to offer humanitarian visas to 9,000 Afghan refugees.
Yes.
Can you say something about what the plan is for resolving the situation of those refugees?
I can't say. I don't know.
Okay.
There is a special organization in Brazil that's very effective, that they are very devoted to their job, which is an organization for refugees. Actually, Brazil was one of the first non-Arab countries to take Palestine from Syria during the war. And, well, some find the country is not rich enough and they come back to the United States. We can't prevent that. But we're doing our best.
All right, I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask a last question, which somebody in the audience has asked. Brazil continues to invest in extracting oil. And how does that work with Brazil's legitimacy as a leader in climate and sustainable development?
The world is complicated. And we need the oil. We need the money that oil brings. We need the money even to have things that combat, to have electric cars, to have battery-moved cars, and so on. So the world is as it is, but we want to diminish our dependence in oil in the long run. We have always voted for that in international fora, and we are working that way.
As we close, that brings our program to a close. But as we close, I want to offer an outside-the-box idea.
You want what?
I want to offer a creative idea, which I think is in spirit of Brazil's foreign policy.
Uh-huh.
You sound skeptical.
I didn't understand what you meant.
Which is, I wonder whether there is an opportunity in this hemisphere for there to be a more formal, like BRICS, a more formal grouping of the members of the G20 in this hemisphere: Brazil, United States, Mexico, Argentina, and Canada. And whether that group, if they met occasionally, could solve some of the problems and also give strength to the G20, perhaps even more strength than a group that is
Well,
dominated by
in many
authoritarians.
respects, our problems are more similar to those of the Africans than some other countries in the hemisphere. I mean, if you compare to Canada, well, Canada fine, but I mean, we are much more similar to Nigeria, to Angola, and to many of these other countries. Geography is important, but it's very important, but it's not the only thing.
Sure.
So, I mean, we would plead for more Africans, 2 or 3 Africans in the G20, and 1 European less. I wouldn't say how.
I mean, if you're pleading for 2 or 3 more and 1 less, then you also need a new kind of math to keep the G20, but that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
you.
I appreciate the conversation.